Let me tell you, for those of you who don't know exactly who Sarah is, who only know a bit, there's a lot to know. She's a New York Times best-selling author and entrepreneur. Her journalism career spanned 20 years across television, radio, magazines, newspaper and online. She is the former editor of Cosmopolitan magazine, and she was host of the first series of MasterChef Australia, which I didn't know was the highest rating show in Australian television history. She is also the author of the New York Times bestseller I Quit Sugar, I don't have to tell you that, I Quit Sugar for Life, and I Quit Sugar Simplicious. And her books are sold in 46 countries and in 12 languages. She's the founder of iQuitSugar.com, and she created the I Quit Sugar 8-week program, which has seen more than 1.2 million people quit sugar worldwide. She blogs on minimalist living, philosophy, anti-consumerism, combating food waste and hiking at sarahwilson.com. Her community extends to 2.3 million people. So when I read that, I thought, what does she know about anxiety? So before I invite the beautiful Sarah to the stage, I want to give you her anxiety CV, which is on page 7 of her book. Sarah was diagnosed with childhood anxiety and insomnia at 12, then bulimia in her late teens, then obsessive-compulsive disorder shortly thereafter, then depression and hypomania, and then in her early 20s, manic depression or bipolar, as it's now called. She's seen dozens of psychiatrists and psychotherapists and spiritual healers. In the 2 years that it took her to write this book and research it, she lived in 9 different countries, moved house 7 times, had 2 suicide attempts. She has done everything, Sarah, but what she says in this book that I think is profoundly interesting is that all of that comes under the umbrella of anxiety. I think it's an incredibly brave book. She's opened herself up magnificently. So can I ask you to please give a very warm welcome to Sarah Wilson.
Thank you.
So the first question I thought I would just throw to you is, when you were getting ready to come today, is there anxiety, or was it just like what we all have, which is a bit of, you know, tingly in the tummy? What's it like when you're anxious?
Well, it's funny because everyday fear, you know, run-of-the-mill fear, normal fear, doesn't get me scared. And it's something that I explore in the book with I contacted a number of different people who'd written about anxiety and had talked about anxiety in blogs and so on, and it's quite a common thing. So I came here from Barrington Tops this morning, and I've been up camping in the Western New South Wales for the last 4 or 5 days. So I was in a different kind of headspace, I've got to say. It was more about coming back into sort of civilization and having to brush my hair and have a shower, which was probably the most daunting thing. But yeah, we were talking backstage that for me, I almost have to plunge myself into fear or fearful situations because that's what kind of makes me feel very alive. And it's a weird kind of thing. I almost feel that it makes me feel all right, so I get anxious about weird things and things that don't make any sense, but hey, everyday fear, I can do it. And it makes me feel a little bit better about stuff. And I say it in the book, it's nothing compared with the shit I make up in my head. You know, sitting here is a cinch, really, in comparison. And I think it's also just getting older. You know, I've done so many fearful things in my life. Everything gets put into perspective. Yeah.
Would you tell, because it's very interesting, Sarah writes about what she calls life naturals in the book, who are presumably mostly the people who don't deal with anxiety. And I think, by and large, I might be a life natural, which is sort of a boring thing to be, but...
Not at all.
No, but I'm fascinated. There are behaviours that you have to deal with. So would you mind explaining them to some people? I mean, there's for instance, taping your lips to sleep, and there's tapping. Could you talk a little about that? Because I think for those of us who don't know it, this stuff is mysterious.
Yeah.
How do we help? How do we deal with
How
the person
weird do
in
I
our
get
life?
is the question. So I've managed to whittle down a lot of my anxious behaviours over the years through the different techniques you mentioned in the intro. And it's a very vigilant kind of process. I'm constantly working on ways to kind of not be too weird for people. But yes, my nighttime routine is one that I've gone, you know what, I've done this as far as I can go. I cannot whittle the weird stuff down any further. So yeah, at night, even in a tent, I was in the Warrumbungles, you know, and I was lying there, and it was a beautiful night. You know, there was Julie Zamiris and Brian Cox just across the valley, you know, filming, and I had it there in my tent. But, you know, I wear earplugs. I've got to tape my mouth shut so I don't grind my teeth, but it's become a comfort thing. Even when I'm out in the bush, I've got a shower, so I always stay in campgrounds near a river or that's got a tank, and this place had a tank on top of the hill, so I research. You know, if you want to know where there's running water in campsites around most of the world, I'm the person. But I've bathed in rivers full of ice. I've bathed in rivers in gorges with crocodiles in them, with my friends with head torches watching the eyes from the other side of the bank to see if they're coming closer as I frantically bathe. So I have to bathe, must bathe. And it's, you know, even if it's rank water in the bottom of a swimming pool in Mexico on Christmas Eve, it's just the psychological comfort, I suppose.
And has that always been the case? Has that always been soothing from way back? Or?
Yeah. This is all that's the obsessive compulsive stuff, and that started really at sort of at 11, and it was all around trying to keep my family safe. I'm the eldest of 6 children. I felt very responsible. So it was, you know, it was based around that, and I had this fear. And obsessive compulsive disorder is about having an obsession and a compulsion at the same time, and they get intertwined. Some people have obsessions, some people have compulsions, but when they work in this kind of, excuse my language, but it's a technical army term, clusterfuck, then you're in trouble. And so it just kind of is this spiral that goes on and on. So yes, it started when I was young, and it's never really left me. But on the bipolar front, I would say that you know, I can ricochet into incredible energy where I don't know anyone who can keep up, you know, and so I go bush. And I've at times gone and live in an army shed in the forest for 1.5 years in Byron Bay. I take myself off away from people. And
then you go and deal with the 2.3 million people who follow you and want you in their lives.
Well, yeah, it's a weird split, but I've come to terms with it. I can see now that that's how, you know, that's how I operate, and I love it. I've found the perfect, I wouldn't call it, you couldn't call it a balance, but I found this, nor a medium. I don't tread in the middle.
No, in fact, you're quite suspicious of balance as an idea. Or not suspicious,
Yeah.
but yes, you question it, don't you?
Yeah, I looked into
Talk a
that
bit
quite
about that,
deeply.
yeah.
One of the great things about being insomniac and having this manic tendency is that you can research a hell of a lot. And so you go down there. I've always gone down rabbit holes, even to research buying a toaster. Not that I own a toaster, but if I did, I would be able to tell you all about the various options. But with the balance thing, this was actually something I came across some years ago about a sociologist was writing about what makes women happy around the world, and they found that all the surveys showed that women in their 40s who are lawyers were the unhappiest people on the planet. Are there any women who are in their 40s who are lawyers in the room?
You wouldn't dare put your hand up.
Yeah, that's right. And are you miserable? But he decided instead to look at what it was that happy women, or women who had some sense of satisfaction and joy and sense that they'd landed in life, what they had in common. What he found was that they actually actively didn't seek balance, and instead they tilted. So they had all this chaos going on, and they'd tilt towards the things that resonated. And I tend to find the same thing. And I think the pursuit of balance, but the pursuit of happiness and all the other self-helpy stuff that we've been doing over the last sort of 30 years, I actually think it's contributed to anxiety. And a lot of studies are showing that that is in fact the case. It's this ideal, which is attainable, I suppose, but the thing is that happiness is only one of about 200 emotions that we're capable of. And I think happiness is pretty good, but it's sort of a byproduct, you know, of better things, to be honest. Yeah. And I've always searched not for a happy life, but for a meaningful life of character. And that's very much what I seek. And going back to the life naturals, what I've found is that a lot of the life naturals in my life have found that very hard to deal with. You know, can't you just be happy? You know, and And my question that I try to answer in this book is, and you know, can't you just get rid of anxiety? And my question is, well, do we want to?
And that's really the radical sort of proposal, I think. So the book, the title, which you're all aware of, which is about making the beast, anxiety, beautiful, I think is quite a radical notion, that actually we don't try to get rid of it or shunt it into a corner, but we sort of learn to love it. So, I mean, I love the story perhaps about the Dalai Lama that begins the book. Maybe you might like to just talk a bit about that and how that began the quest about making it beautiful.
Yeah, if you've meditated with the Dalai Lama in your life, you have to put it in the first chapter of your book, I find. And in fact,
pretty good.
I've met him 3 times now as an ambassador. I don't know why he chose me, but he did, to the Dalai Lama in Australia. And I was told, the first time I went to interview him for a column I used to write for one of the Sunday papers, I was told, well, just stick to one question. You've got an hour, but he will ramble, so there's no point. You know, so get your one question right. And so I went around, you know, I fretted. That's what I fret about, is deciding, choosing. And just as a...
Choices, actually, we'll come back to that.
We'll come back to that,
Choices,
good, remind me, otherwise I'll go off on a tangent. And so I didn't have my question, and I was sitting there opposite the guy, and he'd just blown his nose and tucked it into his robe. And my Year 4 teacher used to do that. She used to
Such
stuff
a
it down her
nana
bra.
thing, isn't
It was very cute. And I said, how do you stop your mind from chattering? How do you get your head to shut up? And he looked at me and laughed and went, don't bother. And he said, if I went and sat on a hill, you know, in a cave for 2 years on my own, and I meditated every single minute of the day, then maybe I could get my head to be quiet for half an hour. And he said, but why bother? I've got better things to do. I'm doing this, I'm doing that. And I went away from it, and the thing that I took from it is this notion that you can be both. You can have an anxious, chattery head, and you can have a meaningful, good life. And that's kind of what's informed where I've gone, well, rather than try to find a happy medium or shut out the anxious bit so this bit can flourish, it goes back to that notion of the tilting. You know, I can do both.
Yeah.
And it just means finding ways to modulate the anxiety so it doesn't take over, and then what you'll find is that will then inform the meaningfulness and the good life. And that's what I've found. As soon as I stopped trying to shut that up, it was actually able to steer this part of my life to even better things. And it's my compass. My anxiety is my compass now. If it starts to get like this, I know I'm doing something that is discordant with my values. And so I started to and then I started investigating the history of bipolar and OCD in particular, and found that, you know, throughout history, 1 to 2% of the population around the world have possessed this kind of behaviour, what we now see as bipolar behaviour or OCD behaviour. And if you go to the Kalahari Desert right now, it'll be the same percentage of people. So say,
which is fascinating, because we tend to think of it as something to do
a
with the
Western
Western
thing. Yeah. So that made me think, well, this evolutionary quirk must exist for a reason. And so I started to look into it, and in fact, they found that it was shaman and community leaders who were the people who possessed these attributes. And so far from being shunted and from being told that they were disordered, they were elevated and told and considered really vital to communities. And
well, could you speak about the Dian Fossey thing? Because one of the other things in the book about making the beast beautiful is seeing the value of the anxious person in the culture. And I love that Dian Fossey story.
Yeah. So I think they were chimps. There was this community of chimps in the 1960s. And that was been studied, and it's one of those studies that is talked about a lot, but the paper was never written in full. So it's a little bit of an anecdote. I treat it as an anecdote, but apparently it did happen. She was studying this particular community, and there was a group that would have displayed OCD and bipolar type qualities. They were hypervigilant, stayed up all night, and kept an eye on things, and they could smell, had very heightened hearing and smell and so on, and fussed. You know, they were the nitpickers. And what happened is they actually did an experiment where they removed that 1 to 2% and found that this community died out, it disintegrated, which, you know, I guess, points to a particular conclusion, doesn't it? But it does, for me, suggest that, anxiety. I mean, anxiety is actually a very important, valid response when it's in its kind of normal understanding or normal functioning. It gets disordered amongst some of us, I think for a reason, but it can also get disordered when we don't value it and we try to shut it up. And
I might get you to talk a little about why you think that is that it gets disordered, because I'm sure all of us have experienced. I'm not an anxiety sufferer, but after my husband died, I experienced panic attacks for the very first time.
Oh, that's an interesting one. Yeah,
I never had them before, and I think they've gone away. But what happens then that some people get? What is it, do you think, that makes some people actually have this experience all the time to deal with?
I might pick up on the panic attack thing because it's quite interesting. I hear, and you probably have heard it as well, about these panic attacks that people have that feel like a heart attack, and I'm sure that may have been what you had. And it often happens at the top of escalators in shopping malls for some reason. I don't know why, but this is what I hear. And it seems to be a thing. Being in a shopping mall is enough to send anyone into a blind panic, I think. And in fact, I explore that in the book, that there's a lot about shopping malls that can cause anxiety. So I sort of throw that in there because one of the things I try to do is get people out of shopping malls. So I think that, I took it to a psychiatrist who explores some of these notions, and I said, why is it? I had a panic attack when I was 18 and I was studying law, and I was in the middle of an exam and totally panicked, and the lack of breath, not being able to stop my heart, and so on. And it went on for about 20 minutes. And that was the only time I'd had it. And I said, but what I call a sort of a panic attack is very different. I call it a clusterfuck of thoughts, where I go into this spiral and these thoughts keep coming in, and they just can't stop. And they're every time, and I'm trying to solve them all. And it's all pulling out that way and it's all going in this way, and the net result is absolute lack of movement, and then I freeze. And that's when I can, at times, I can get very self-destructive, because it's my way of stopping the thoughts. There's no other way. I've tried everything and just nothing will stop it. And I said, what's the difference, because I don't get the heart palpitations. And he said, well, people who haven't had a background of anxiety pretty much 24/7 all their lives, when they have the flight or fight response in extreme from something that's been triggered, a fair enough trigger, death of a husband, then it's all very new. And so those reactions, the flight or fight response, is pretty honest and raw. It's what we did when we were being chased by saber-toothed tigers, And so you go through the symptoms of being chased by a saber-toothed tiger. And then what you do is you go, I'm actually dying and I don't know what's happening, and that's when you panic. And so that's a panic attack. And the best advice I can give to anyone who has that kind of what's called a somatic panic attack is to accept they only last 20 to 30 minutes.
So run with it.
Just sit with it, and go, okay, this is happening. Unfortunately, people who get somatic panic attacks don't tend to get them all their life, like yourself. So it's probably not worth remembering.
It's interesting, isn't it, to the language then? I said run with it and you said sit with it.
Yeah.
And I mean, I suppose because I don't understand it, my thing is to run away, whereas you have come to understand something about it, so it's sit with it.
I can't outrun the stuff. Like, I've tried, that Sesame Street thing, can't go over it. Can't go around it, must go through it. And I mean, that's the book, isn't it? You've got to go through it. And I conclude at the end, I won't give away all the ending bits, but the sort of the theme I explore, which is a very recent exploration, is this notion of grace. And so the other beautiful thing about anxiety is it takes us to that point of grace. And grace is when you finally feel held. So anxiety for me is basically triggered by a sense that there's more to life. What the hell is life about? I need to, it's a yearning for something else, I call it. It's, it's not all this, it's not shopping malls.
You talk about another beautiful image, which you'll all know, the image of a dog running around in circles, trying to find where it belongs.
Trying to find the perfect spot to sit, and then suddenly it just decides and it's perfectly happy. I think for anxious people, it's this kind of circling, trying to find your spot. And what's kind of funny is that anxiety sees you reach outwards to self-help books, medication, new boyfriend, new throw cushion, new car, you know, and the next new salvation. Now, the funny irony, and I talk about all these ironies throughout the book, is that you eventually realise that the anxiety gets so bad, it actually then points you back to where the answer is, which is the thing that triggered the anxiety, which is back to yourself. The only way to sit with anxiety is to actually literally sit in it and come back closer. And I've got a chapter called Closer, and it's about coming back to yourself, because that's what we seek. So it's this funny sort of full circle that anxiety takes you on. But if you don't go on that full circle, you then almost miss out on these moments of grace. And grace is when you literally get rewarded for coming back, you know? And I've had ridiculous moments in grace, like where I've owed
that story, yes,
I owed a particular amount of money. It was $9,025, which is quite specific, right? Ironically, it was an advance on a book about a porn star where I had to go. I went to LA and I've been in a porn movie. That was another journey.
We want that story too.
I had to pay it back because the porn star got cold feet, and so the book fell apart, and I had to pay back this amount, and I was completely broke. I'd lost everything. I could no longer walk. I couldn't work. I was just a mess, and I didn't know what to do. And I won't tell you the full story, but let's just say $9,025 landed in my lap through the most bizarre circumstance, to the cent. And I've actually got the two documents where it's $9,025, and I was like, right, there's something going on here. And it was because I'd finally stopped. I'd stopped and I gave in, and, you know, I hate to use these woo-woo words because it's a bit like God language. We were talking about that earlier. But I surrendered. And that's when the good stuff started to happen. And yeah,
But it's a constant conversation in the book and even here. I'm sure you're picking up on it, that there's this kind of duality. So, you know, you've got to stop, but you're one of the most high-achieving people on the planet. And you write very beautifully about the way in which having to make choices is hard for people with anxiety. And yet many of the people who suffer from anxiety are the great world leaders.
Yeah.
And there's this kind of constant toing and froing. So how do you then bring that together in your own mind? Because even your own research is constantly throwing up these dualities.
Yeah. Well, it's really funny. I've had to sort of almost coach journalists in how to talk to me about this, because they go, I don't know where to start. You know, and I said, oh, look, it's okay, because anxiety is, and I use this word throughout, it's, like I said before, it's a US military term. It's a clusterfuck. Yeah. It's like a knotted ball of wool. And many of us would like to be able to one day find the perfect solution where we can unravel the wool and we'll have this nice clear thread to life. And I'm like, no, it's not going to happen in this lifetime. It's about loosening. And it's, you know, it's to go back to the question you asked before, it's been both.
And but it seems to me too that it's kind of learning to live with mess, isn't it? You know, like learning to live with...
Sit in the shit.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, I've actually got, there's a chapter called The Wobbler's Table at the Cafe. I'm not joking, I spent about 9 months of my life in existential angst around finding, because I'd been working in magazines and I used to see these people having languid cups of coffee at 10:30 in the morning around Bondi, right? And I'd go, how does this happen? This is what I'm going to do one day. And so when I finally left my job in magazines, I set out to go and do the cryptic crossword at an inappropriate time of day, which was 10:30 in the morning, and have a coffee. 9 months, I kid you not, I grappled with it, because I'd walk down the road all excited and then would stall because I couldn't work out which cafe to go to. And then when I got there, I couldn't work out tea or coffee. And it was just so ridiculous. I used to actually slump into the gutter in tears and then have to go home. It took me 6 times the first time to get to a cafe. And when I finally got there, of course, I tried to find the perfect table that didn't wobble. And of course, as soon as you try to do that, you're at the table where the air conditioning's blasting on you, and then you get burnt toast, and then, they forget your coffee and it comes out cold. And that's what happens, when you grip and you grip and you grip. And so it was, what was the question? I've meandered. It was a 9-month ordeal, and you can see I was very affected by it.
Well, actually, what you're taking me to is, again, that thing of decisions.
Oh, yeah,
We were
yeah.
talking about living with mess, but in fact, again, to the thing of decisions, because it seems to me that's such a first world thing. I know the Kalahari have it, but you write a lot about making decisions and how that promotes anxiety and the
Yeah.
supermarket and all that. How do you exist when you're running a big company and you've got to make decisions, constantly? What is that? How do you go, okay, that's all right?
Well, you mentioned about world leaders, and so a lot of world leaders in times of crisis were bipolar. So Winston Churchill, so it's generally in times of crisis. So when the proverbial hits the fan, that's when you want someone with bipolar around you, because it's like, voomp, we're here.
It's not what we think, is it?
We're here. We can just go laser sharp to what needs to be done. It's in sort of the everyday that we don't cope. And my friend said to me, you don't find stress stressful. You find being human stressful. But back to your thing, the thing about decisions is that the decision-making part of the brain is very closely intertwined with the very gnarly old part of the brain that controls anxiety. So if anyone who finds that when they have to make lots of decisions, or even if it's what toothpaste to buy, they'll get anxious, then it's completely understandable. You're basically overworking the same part of the brain. Ditto, if you're an anxious person, you find decisions, and if you're in the middle of a panic attack, you cannot make a decision. Never ask somebody going through a panic attack, what would you like to do? Would you like Malaysian or Vietnamese tonight? Because that will just, see them hit the roof. Make decisions for them. That's the best thing that you can do when somebody's in that space. But I find it really worthwhile understanding that that's what happens. And so a lot of studies have been done in and around this, and a lot of world leaders and very prominent entrepreneurs and creatives who struggle with anxiety have adopted this practice. So for instance, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg all wear the same outfit every single day. So does Barack Obama, because Barack read about this research and he just went and bought, I think, 7 of the same suits. So did Carl Stefanovic, but we'll put him in another category for the moment. So they've adopted these practices, and also a lot of the big names and minds that I spoke to in the book, I said to them, what did you eat for breakfast? I ate the same thing every day. It's exactly the same thing every day. I never mix it up. And you'll find that a lot of high-octane people will eat the same breakfast every single day. So they're things that I do in my own way. So one of the number one things that I advocate is to have a morning routine. So if you can get to as far as down the day as you can by routinising as much as you can. So do the same kind of exercise, just get up, do the exercise, do this, do that, and just have it all kind of fairly rote, then you basically prevent your anxious part of the brain being overtaxed. So for me, without realising this, and it's retrospectively that I realised, that I understood the science or the psychology behind it. I've naturally, as my anxiety has worsened over the years, pared back. So I live out of 2 suitcases of belongings. I have no furniture. I've never owned a fridge. I've never owned. I'm 43, and I bought a couch once, and it took me 3 years to research. Steve Jobs took 8. He also can't make decisions like that because he has to over-research. And so I've given up on all of that now. The couch, by the way, sat in my otherwise empty apartment, which I bought because I did all the sensible things for a while, for 3 weeks. And then I went, I'm taking off. I'm out of here. And it's sitting on its own in a storage facility out in the northern beaches. Yeah. Anyway, so I'll come back and sit on it one day, but just not yet. But I've just kept my life very, very simple. I ride a single-speed bike. No gears to get greasy and have to, fix. And so I simplify. I also try to defer some decisions and, allow myself to be rendered choiceless. Again, it's another moment in sitting in it. Choosing the wobbly table at the cafe is another one. Actively choosing the grim experience. And then it can't get worse, right? This is it. Sit in the shit. You know how children can sit in the soggiest puddle and there's mud oozing into their nappy and they're just happy and they've found the soggiest bit in the playground, to sit there, and I think that it's part of the human experience is to be rendered choiceless is the ultimate freedom. So if you can do that as much as you can, so long-winded answer once again, but I just try to prevent myself from having to make small decisions as often as possible.
There's a very interesting thing too. Traditionally, we know that. If we think about times like mourning, which is a very stressful time, we used to have mourning clothes. We used to put on the same outfit, just wear black. There are actually traditional things
as well,
and rituals that we've come away from. But
rituals have existed to again render us choiceless, so we don't have to make those decisions. And yet we've lived in a culture where we think that choice is supreme. It's not. The Paradox of Choice by Barry Schwartz, he looked into all of this, and another wonderful, wonderful writer, if you ever want to read a really cracking book, Sheena Iyengar, and I've forgotten the name of the book now. But anyway, it's again about choice theory. She's this blind academic. She's literally blind, and she wrote this book about arranged marriages versus, love marriages. And it's a fascinating story, but it goes into all of this. But we don't like choices. We don't respond well to it, and that is because they make us anxious. And
interestingly, they're freedom, but they don't give you freedom.
Well, Kierkegaard, famously wrote that anxiety is the dizzying effect of choice, and I think that's, it's this notion of going to the abyss and having 360 degrees of options. Where on earth do you grasp, And that is, I consider, that's existential angst right there.
One of the things about reading the book, I should say the book is actually really structured in an interesting way. It's sort of 138 mini chapters, really. I mean, there are chapters, but it's really 138 small chapters. And then there are little sidebars, and there's kind of little comments and lists of things. And so it's a very entertaining, engaging read, but I also was struck by it feels like it's a different kind of mind. It doesn't feel anxious, but it's a different kind of mind writing it, And when you said that bits of it had been written in a manic episode and then taken out, I had this sense of entering the mind through it. But one of the questions I want to ask you is, I also sort of began to fall in love a bit with the idea of anxiety. It was like, you have to be anxious to be creative, and you have to be anxious to get things done. And one of my questions is, we as a culture, I think, have fallen in love with the idea that to be seen as successful, we have to look busy, we have to look stressed, we have to be able to say to our friends, I'm so busy. And I wondered,
is that a pitfall of
Is it a pitfall?
Discussion?
And also, how do we get to a point where success looks like, I'm just kind of
chilling,
sitting in my life, whatever, but yes, what's your feeling about that?
Yeah, and I actually issue a caveat at some point in the book where I go, we've got to be very careful that we don't glamorise anxiety.
Yeah.
There ain't nothing glamorous about this at all. I'm just trying to swing the pendulum back from complete disordered kind of diagnosis.
And also not talking about it.
And not talking about it. And I probably go to a little bit of an extreme to sort of make it not light, but bring it forward into the light to be able to discuss it in a different way, in a conversation. And so, but I do hear what you're saying, and in fact, part of the problem with diagnosing anxiety is the fact that, and part of the problem with understanding anxiety is that so much of our contemporary culture, as you say, is around multitasking, being hypervigilant, I only got 3 hours sleep last night, which suggests that you're a very important person. And then, toggling, having too many screens open, the life naturally my life, who was with me throughout the writing of the book. Now, laid back, this guy's almost catatonic. Like he's a surfer and fisherman for the northern beaches, and a painter, and sometimes an electrician, and sometimes, if he's not in Micronesia, chasing a wave or whatever. But yeah, he used to say, we used to have a ritual of surf and turf locals night at the Mona Vale pub on a Monday night, and I'd arrive just like this from writing all day, and he'd go, sweetie, you know what your problem is? You've got too many tabs in your brain open. And I said, one night I yelled at him, at least I know how to turn the computer on, He couldn't. But it is true. We live in a culture where that kind of behaviour is kind of exalted in many ways. But and so what we're seeing children in particular, where I call it sort of everyday fair enough anxiety, which is fair enough anxiety. Like it's, a response to a parents divorcing or having to do public speaking or having a death in the family. They are real. That's a fair enough response to, a harsh experience. But what we're seeing is because people are living, emulating that anxious experience, the toggling, the hypervigilance, the always on, the fight or flight response, you've got children who are living that way and they're tipping over into the bucket, which I call the so-called disordered anxiety, where you start to develop symptoms which are out of proportion to the fear or the threat. And it is a very, very big problem. So I'm certainly not trying to advocate getting anxious to get something done. What I'm trying to do is prevent people who have anxiety from not being able to get something done and from, giving themselves a hard time.
Also for someone like me, for those of us who don't actually suffer it in an ongoing way, to understand it.
That's
Because you
the
talk
biggest
about
thing.
the partner too at one point, don't you?
The biggest feedback, the book's been out, I think, 3-4 weeks now. The most beautiful, encouraging, heartening feedback has been from people's partners who contact me and go, and mothers and fathers of teenage children, where they go, I get it now. My kid has been trying to tell me this. And one of the big things, if anyone in the audience has a loved one who's anxious and they struggle to understand it, one of the things that I'm getting a lot of feedback on is from some parents is saying, I've been trying to stop my daughter or my son from doing whatever ritualistic behaviour it might be to cope with their stress. And she said, I finally realised that's their coping mechanism. That's not the problem.
Like tapping on doors and things, which
Tapping
fascinates me.
or washing or, where do we stop, with some of the things that OCD can produce. And they said, I finally can see that this is a symptom. This makes them feel safe. It makes them feel held. And the best thing I can do is work with them, allow them that behaviour, and then to hold them, Same with insomnia, understanding insomnia as a sense that, like young children are held and comforted and they eventually learn to self-soothe. And, it's a struggle that a parent has for some time. And eventually the child feels safe and is okay to get to sleep on their own. I think that a lot of anxious people didn't learn that. Or it got intercepted or they unlearnt it. And I think one of the most heartening things, as I say, is the feedback from loved ones who go, I know what to do now. And I can see that they're not trying to control me, they're trying to control the circumstances that make them anxious. And that's
a big difference.
That's what I've been trying to say to partners and my parents and whoever over the years is, I'm not trying to control you, I'm just trying to control that so that I don't ruin our coffee date or whatever it might be. But it's a very, very hard thing for a loved one to kind of understand.
To understand that.
It's a big ask.
Now, I know that you will have questions, and there are 2 microphones down the front here, so if anyone does have a question, can I ask you to come down to the front? And the other thing, while you're doing that, I just thought you might like to hear Sarah read just a little fragment, because it's always nice to hear the writer read. And this is actually a description from her, which I think is very beautiful. So we'll have this little reading, and then we'll go straight to your question. And so it's her description of what it is to sort of live with it, and I think it's really lovely. It starts down there, Sarah.
I should say Ailsa chose this. I could not possibly make such a decision.
And I'm bossy.
As to what to read.
We're a good couple.
As
I'm
a life
bossy.
natural, she can make a decision. It's great. I said, did you notice I kept deferring to you? You're like,
I know,
how
I
would you
love
like
it.
to do this? I'm like, you
Can I have this all the time?
Yeah. So it's in a chapter called Do the Work, and it's this notion that you've got to be responsible, and you can sit around talking about this stuff, and you can read lots of self-help books, I guess like this one, but eventually I say, frankly, if you've got this far into the book, you have little choice. You've sold the farm and you're on your way. You have to do the work. And to heal, we have to weave our own unique path through it all because it's a responsibility. In my experience, living with a wobbly mind is akin to being charged with carrying around a large, shallow bowl filled to the brim with water for the rest of your life. You have to tread super carefully so as not to slosh it all out. So you must learn to walk steadily and gently and be super aware of every movement around you, ready to correct a little bit of off-balanceness here, a tilt to the left there. This is just the way it is. Living this way requires vigilance and is about constant refinement. If you waver and get unsteady, the water starts to slosh. And if you don't bring yourself back quick enough, the sloshing gathers momentum and, well, you lose it, right? And just to really drag out this metaphor, this means you then have to return to the source and fill it back up all over again, which is tiring, so tiring. And just to push it a touch further, to carry the bowl steadily means walking in a pretty straight line, which means there will be scenarios and environments and people that simply are not conducive to your journey. They're too bumpy or jarring or wobbly or crooked. Me, I can't do late nights at bars, and I struggle around people who live loud and fast, which is why a dark room like this is just lovely. Don't get me near people on cocaine. Their frenetic energy drags me way out to the bumpiest of tracks. I say this with all kinds of clean living piety. Cocaine is antithetical to anyone on the path to truth. I don't say the same about other drugs, apart from sugar. I can't remember writing that, but
It's very
it must
good
be true.
though, isn't
It's in the
it?
book.
It's very good. Don't you think it gives you a great picture of what it is? Let's have your question. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank
I
you.
just wanted people to actually hear the voice.
Like Sarah, I suffer from anxiety. Mine is fairly recent and it decided to be accompanied by depression and PTSD. I have all my life been somebody well in control and I am no longer in control. That control is gone. There are times where I have to walk out. Just coming in here today, I could do it because it was the third one I've been to today and because my husband is there holding my hand as I wring my hands. Mm-hmm. As a result of this now trying to find control again in my life, I read a lot, I go to lectures, I do things. And recently somebody said to me that anxiety was not something that was genetic, but anxiety was something that was learned. And I struggle with that quite a lot, and I was just wondering how you feel about that kind of description.
So it's kind of the nature versus nurture argument, and I think every single person who's suffered some kind of anxious disorder, or I hate using that word disorder, but it's to distinguish it from normal anxiety, fair enough anxiety, has asked that question. It's like, where did this come from? And you can go back and look at genetics, you can go back and look at serotonin levels in your brain, in your gut, and all kinds of things. And I've done that, and it's an exhausting and fruitless thing to do, I find. It's great to understand and to read other people's thoughts on it, but at the end of my journey with all of that, I just decided it doesn't really matter. Here I am, anxious. I'm more than halfway through my life, and I just want to get on with finding a way to live with it in a meaningful way. So I get what you're saying, but also I pick up on this notion of getting control of your life. And just one thing, and it's just one thought amongst many that somebody could plant before you, is maybe anxiety came along to stop you from trying to have control. And I just wonder, because I only say that because I believe that that's why my anxiety has taken me to where it's taken me, and that is to let go a little bit. So maybe the solution won't be to get control. It'll be finding a wonderful new way to manage your life. But the nature versus nurture one, nobody's got an answer. And just to give some context, anxiety was only diagnosed officially by the DSM, which is the manual that's used in Australia by psychiatrists. That's the diagnostic tool, in 1980. So it's a very new diagnosis, and even to this day, when two psychiatrists with the same patient diagnose the same patient using this DSM tool, they will get the same diagnosis in about 32% of cases. It's a very, very inaccurate tool. And anybody in this realm understands that anxiety, more so than a lot of other mental health issues, is a really slippery one. And it's part of the reason I wrote the book. So I was like, in the absence of a full understanding by anybody else, let's choose the discussion we're going to have around it. Let's choose how we're going to live with it. I mean, it sounds like you're on a journey to investigate all of these things, and you may come up with another conclusion, but do understand the nature versus nurture thing. It's really hard to solve. Nobody's solved it yet. You're not alone.
Thank you for asking the question. I imagine it took a bit of
Yeah,
courage to stand
bravo.
up. Yeah.
Bravo. Yeah.
Yes.
My question's really to do with young people. So many young people today are diagnosed with anxiety disorder and are medicated because of that. There seem to be so many teenagers on medication. I just wondered what your opinion and perhaps experience of that.
Yeah, I think it's a really important one, and it's one that's emerged for me more so since I've written the book, because so many people have come to me asking that question, parents and teachers. I think there's a range of things going on. Like I mentioned before, I think that children are being exposed to anxiety emulating kind of stuff, too much technology. I know it sounds like a cliche, but I really do think that it's wiring their brains to toggle, which emulates the freneticness of anxiety. And so if they weren't anxious, by repeatedly doing these anxious type activities, they can rewire their brains, and we see that happening. And of course, then giving a drug to that as though they've got some kind of inevitable condition, therefore they must take a drug, just is entirely irresponsible and cruel to this generation of children, because we're not looking at what is the cause of it. And of course the cause goes deeper than the technology. It's why we're giving children technology and allowing them, way too much time with technology. There's also a lot of evidence that just the food that we're eating has a very big part to play, which sounds like that's a bit soft. But 80% of the serotonin in our bodies is found in our gut. And the most convincing, compelling science now, going back to that nature versus nurture thing, the most compelling science that's emerging is around the idea of gut bacteria, so the microbiota. And so ADHD, depression, Alzheimer's, anxiety, various anxious conditions have been very linked to where the gut bacteria is, which is dictated to us by food and also by over-sanitisation when you're a child. So there's a bunch of concrete, tangible, material things that are happening to the way that children are having to live these days, which I think are contributing. And giving medication it's a shame. That said, I was medicated at 17. I was Prozac Nation had just come out. It was all fairly new. I was one of the first people to go on Zoloft in Australia. And I've got to say, and I say this in the book, I'm not anti-medication, because you know what? Whatever gets you through the night sometimes, And I'm open about the fact that I still have to take Valium every now and then. I take medication for bipolar, but I go on off it, and I go down to the smallest amount that I can possibly control, cope with, and then have long slabs of time with nothing. But I feel that as a teenager in particular, it's not a bad thing to be given medication. If you are not coping, then to have a diagnosis and a drug allows you to put what's going on to you on a shelf. And it's got a special mark on it, and your friends and your family and teachers can understand it, and you can get a bit of breathing room to get yourself established. And that's certainly what it was for me. So I was able to then cope and then start to investigate other things, and all the stuff that I now find is far more long-term comforting. So I think you were more really raising an observation, but then asking my opinion on all that. It's convoluted. It's got multifacets.
I have a daughter who's being treated for anxiety and is medicated, and it does concern me.
Could you maybe just step a bit closer to the mic? Thanks.
So I was just saying, it's from a personal view, really, because I have a daughter who is being treated for anxiety by medication, and I know so many
How
young
old is
people. She's 18 now, and she's been treated for 2 years with a little bit of obsessive compulsive disorder, mostly relating from an anxiety disorder.
There's no quick fix, there's no magic bullet, there's no easy answer. And in some ways, if she's 18, in some ways, I think that she probably will have to go on her own journey with this. Medication is not a bad thing. This is my personal belief, based on my personal experience, if it can get you to a place where you can then start to make bigger, more important decisions for yourself. It's just It's just the way things are. But, you know, I think the thing that maybe you could find comfort in is finding ways to understand it better and find ways to support her from a different direction. And I think that that's probably a really wonderful thing to do.
Just so many things that you spoke about here was really quite enlightening for me and gave me a little bit of insight into how she feels at different times or must be feeling.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
My pleasure. Well, she's lucky to have a mum who's engaged and come along today.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We've got one last quick question and then we'll have to wind up, sadly.
Okay, hope it's a quick one. Thank you. When you were talking, it reminded me of a time I was about 14, 15, when looking back, I was quite depressed. And at school, I was for half the year sitting to this peer who was extremely anxious. I think now she would have been diagnosed as anxiety disorder, medicated, and so on. And what I remember is being so envious of her because she was alive and I felt half dead. And I wonder if you can say something about this.
Depression versus anxiety. Yeah.
The sort of.
It's an interesting one, and it was very much something, because I had depression in my teens, as well as hypomania, so it would ricochet me out. I think just fear of feeling half dead would ricochet me. You know, I'd find every last bit of energy to sort of escape that sort of heaviness. So yeah, it's something that I looked into, and in fact I spoke to a number of people who have both and have experienced both. And there's a guy called Matt Haig who wrote a book called Reasons to Stay
yes,
Alive.
yes.
Yeah, and he actually discusses it. I think it was him, and he said that he would prefer to be depressed rather than anxious. And he actually interviewed quite a few people who felt the same way. Because anxiety might look productive, but that's just the tip of the iceberg of what goes on to get moments of productivity. And in fact, it's highly unproductive a lot of the time. At my worst, when before I was diagnosed with bipolar, when I was living in America, I was mad. I couldn't go to university. I couldn't write my name on a piece of paper. I spent 6, 7, 8, 9 hours a night going up and down a small patch of carpet, pulling dirt out, and couldn't leave the house. So, you know, it kind of was as unproductive as depression on steroids, you know, and with just complete agony. I also think it's quite a lonely, I talk about this a lot, anxiety is a very lonely thing as well. Because you're often seen as productive and hypervigilant and capable and an A-type, and you're the person in the front row, you know, who gets up to the microphone to ask questions and things like that. And so you look, for all intents and purposes, like somebody who's functioning, and it's part of the condition to push people away when you're not coping, which is exactly when you need people. Whereas with depression, I think sometimes, because you're still, people can come to you. You know, they can see you as small, fragile, weak, and therefore vulnerable and requiring of help. Anxiety is very hard to identify. So it sounds like I'm saying anxiety is harder. I guess I'm just trying to create the balance. It's more of a discussion, isn't it, as to the differences and how people perceive it and what it looks like when you're on one side of the fence. It's an interesting one. And then there's the argument that they are the same thing on the same spectrum. Sorry, different things on the same spectrum, you know, and also that one is a coping mechanism to the other. So I think it's 80% of people with depression also have anxiety, and 90% of people with anxiety also have depression, or something like that. So the overlap is definitely there. Yeah.
Okay.
One of the things I found very beautiful in the book is that you say anxiety is about the future, thinking about the future,
yes.
and depression is about the past, which at 14 is perhaps not so, I don't know. But
But
sadly,
the answer then, of course, to both is to try to live in the present. So it's the same answer.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
very sadly, because I do feel we could go on for quite some time, but Sarah has a date with all of you in the bookstore. She's going to be signing, aren't you? Yes.
Yeah.
So what I can say to you is there is this and so much more in the book. If you have questions about anxiety, go to the bookstore. It was an eye-opener for me. It's a pleasure to read. It's a great pleasure to have sat here with Sarah. Can I ask you all to say thank you to her?
Thank you.